And first, we're going to hear a few words from Tao Zhang, the Deputy Managing Director from IMF.
First, let me thank the organizers of the Reykjavík Global Forum for all they have done to advance the cause of gender equality, and for bringing us together for this important panel on fintech and inclusive economic growth. It is fitting that this initiative would come out of Iceland, a country that has led the way on women's empowerment for many years. It was 45 years ago last month that 90% of women in Iceland went on strike to what became known as the Women's Day Off. It was a turning point. To quote the woman who would 5 years later become Iceland's first woman president and the world's first woman elected president, things went back to normal the next day, but with the knowledge that women are, as well as men, the pillars of society. This knowledge is why I felt it was so important for me to participate today. Gender equality is not just women's issue. It is everybody's issue. Women and men together are better off when there is a gender equality. IMF research backs this up. Sadly, this pandemic threatens to roll back gains in women's economic opportunities, widening gender gaps. That's why today's discussion is critical. Financial inclusion of women, supported by fintech, is one of the best ways to increase growth and reduce inequality after the crisis. In fact, our research shows that the largest reductions in income inequality can come from women gaining access to finance. Unfortunately, we still see a significant gap. IMF data shows that the average share of female depositors and borrowers is at about 44 and 40% respectively. Digital financial services help narrow the gap, but challenges in financial infrastructure, financial and digital literacy, and social norms remain major roadblocks. Governments can help in 3 big ways. First, build up digital infrastructure. This includes addressing gender gaps in access to electricity, mobile, internet, and digital ID. In some countries, men are 20% points more likely than women to have their own phone. Second, support education for women. Education of women in STEM will improve financial and digital literacies and help break down social norms that have held women back in the technology field. Third, create the right fundamentals for inclusion. Ensuring more competitions in the fintech industries and avoiding biases in the data that exclude women are key to creating an inclusive and sustainable recovery. I know you will have much to discuss on these important topics today. I wish you a productive conversation and great progress for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Tao Zhang, for such incredible words of wisdom, and most importantly, reinforcing that gender equality is not a female issue, it's a social and economic issue. So we are so thrilled to be here today with the Reykjavík Global Forum Women Leaders 2020 talking about financial inclusion. And what we truly understand and what we know time and time again, tools and technologies boost economic growth. That is very clear. What is available today to enable market access? It's about access, it's about opportunity, it's about policies across all enterprises and businesses. What's available for women-owned businesses, women-led businesses, and most dependable drivers of economic growth and stability. And so to have this important conversation about the power of fintech and market access, which we talk a lot about technology as a great enabler, and in my opinion, a great connector for accessibility around the globe. I am thrilled to have three incredible experts joining us today for the conversation. So welcome. So happy to have you here. Sue, can you please tell everyone who you are, what you do, and let's just open with a core basic question. What do you think the greatest financial inclusion barriers are today?
So firstly, thank you very much for having me, and I hope everybody's doing well and is safe. So I'm Kelsey. I work at Mastercard, and I lead the company's global efforts around financial inclusion, which includes being accountable for our commitment to helping to include 1 billion people into the world's digital economy by 2025. And, to answer your question, Shelley, I think that, unfortunately, step one still is about access. I don't think it's the only barrier, but I think it's still a significant barrier that we need to face. There's still 1.7 billion people across the world who don't have access to something that you and I might think of as very commonplace, which is a bank account. And that is actually exacerbated for women. 72% of men across the world have access to an account, whereas only 65% of women have access to accounts. So I think that there's still work to do on that. Also, as we think about small business owners, women have, particularly during this pandemic, been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. We're seeing 7 percentage points higher of closed women-owned businesses during the pandemic than male-owned businesses. And we still see a huge gap in access to things like capital and credit. Women own 33% of the world's small businesses, but they only get access to 5% of the world's capital and loans. And that leaves a $330 billion opportunity on the table in credit lending alone, which can help them add to their businesses, but also help with education as well. I might touch on that a little bit later. So my answer, unfortunately, would be it's still primarily number one is about access.
Well, which is amazing, especially considering that over 85% of purchase decisions are made by women, and yet we are still falling disproportionately behind across the board, especially with access. So thank you for that. Hi, Dr. Obi. So happy to have you here with us as well. Can you let everyone know who you are, what you do, and the same thing, what you see one of the greatest barriers to financial inclusion being today?
Hi, everyone. My name is Ezekwesili. I run the Africa Economic Development Policy Initiative, which is a program that advises leaders on the continent of Africa on policies that promote inclusive growth. The topic that we discuss is one that I really am interested was put on the agenda of the WLPL for this year. And the reason is that if we are at all going to make any appreciable progress in closing the economic gap between men and women, whether in the advanced economies or in the developing economies, we must pay attention to how technology quickly bridges that gap. And technology, especially as it affects access to capital, which is a major barrier for male-owned businesses and female-owned businesses. And the fact that when you assess what goes on, even with fintech, it appears like we carried the gap in the traditional systems of access to capital straight into the technology plane. And so without a deliberate approach at making technology a solution to the gap that existed before technology, we're simply going to widen the gap between men and women as far as financial inclusion goes. And so if you, focused on one key thing that is the biggest barrier, I would say that access to capital is a big barrier, and that technology does not on its own solve it. What I see is with male funders or male founders and female founders, we're still very worldwide apart. Only just about 7 founders of fintech are women. And so clearly the needs of women are not yet being reflected, even in terms of the provision of access to capital because of technology.
So one of the greatest barriers is we also need more women in fintech to make sure that we are consciously, giving more assistance and access across the board. So thank you for that, Dr. Obi. And Christian, what about you? Hi, how are you?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm Christian Lanng. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Tradeshift. I live here in the Bay Area, close to Silicon Valley, and I think we actually got to start with how these technologies are designed. And if you look at it, right, there's a 70% gap of smartphone ownership in Southeast Asia, 30% in Africa, between men and women. So that means if we even want to talk access to bank accounts or financial services, we need to talk about having access to technology that allows us to even visit those services. And actually, unfortunately, it's going the wrong way. If you look at a technology like 5G, it's made for high-density urban environments. It can do incredibly fast speeds, north of a gigabit in closed cities, but it requires 3 times the battery life, much more advanced devices. It's not very great for rural coverage, right? So we actually have an issue where the technologies that are being designed, that are driving our access, is becoming less inclusive. They're becoming more requirements to economy and investment, even in getting access, right? So I fear that sort of distance between those who have access and those who don't, and not just basic access, but access to a full set of services, is going to increase. And that matters if you think about education through online media. It matters as we're doing right now over Zoom. Well, if you don't have high bandwidth connections, you're never going to do anything over Zoom, right? And that problem probably have its roots where I'm sitting, right? I mean, 4% of venture capital go to female founders. Around 24% of tech workers are female. It used to be that all programmers were women. So we clearly had like a massive slide here in a whole, not just 1, but 2 or 3 lost generations of participation in technology. And that, I think, have impacted how we design our technologies and how we build them. We don't think inclusion into the design phase.
Well, I think that is such an important point, especially with consciousness in the design phase, which is why we also need more women in technology across the board, which I think will go a long way to some of the solutions that we're going to now talk about. And so I want to go back, Sue, to you. Let's go to solutions. We are now in Reykjavík talking about a country that is the first in so many ways. We need to be and they're the first in gender equality year after year, according to the World Economic Forum gender equality reports. It's about intentionality. It's about consciousness. So if we want to have financial inclusion for everyone, anywhere, everywhere, and we still see that so many women disproportionately are being unbanked, from entrepreneurs, small business owners, and having access to this economy, formal economy. What can we do? We keep talking about the problems. We've now just talked about the barriers and the challenges. Let's get to solutions. They can't be this difficult. Share some solutions.
Yeah, so the Christian mentioned about, we need to be thinking about how we design solutions. And, typically we find that, the world was not built with women in mind or with women included. And that has to change. And we have to think about the data first and foremost that we are using to understand how best to build products and solutions and ecosystems with women in mind. Next week, actually, we'll be launching our 4th annual report of the Mastercard Index for Women Entrepreneurs. It is a study over 58 countries and reaches just under 80% of the female labor force. And it's that kind of data in scale that we really need to understand women's needs and their requirements. So I'd say that the first piece is data and understanding. But I wanted to give you an example of how that might show up in practice. And at Mastercard, in partnership with Unilever, we launched a program in Kenya called Jaza Duka. The translation meaning fill up your store, because the majority of store owners in Kenya are women. And by providing a way of understanding what Unilever products the female store owner had bought, combined with Mastercard analytics, we actually found a way of creating an alternative assessment of credit scoring, which allowed more women to borrow responsibly against that access to capital that Dr. Obi was talking about. And through that solution, we've found that more than 50% of those female store owners have increased their sales by 20%, which is a really positive outcome in itself. But it actually becomes a positive self-fulfilling upward cycle, because what women are doing with that increase in sales is they're reinvesting in their business, but secondly, they're reinvesting in education for their children, which is a really critical step as we think about inclusion of women into the next generation. Because we typically see that for every additional year that a child goes to school, and there are still 700 million children across the world who don't have basic literacy, for every additional year that a child goes to school, their earning potential goes up by about 8 to 10 percentage points. And that's further still with women. So I think if we can get to really understanding what women's needs are, not only does it help them, but it has the opportunity to help female generations ahead of them.
And before we move forward from differences between men and women needs, what have you found the greatest differentiator between, what men and women need? And I just want to reinforce education. When you educate a girl, you educate a family. So differentiator.
So I think that, a very important takeaway for our conversation is that the fintech business is still a business. It's not charity. People want to be able to establish businesses and make money. And so the incentives have to align properly for there to be services being offered women by any fintech company. And so that's where policy now gets in. When governments consider the criticality of running inclusive economies, then they design economic strategies from that purview. And then fintech becomes one of the tools through which they achieve that overarching objective of ensuring the full participation of women in business and in economic activities. So making sure that governments are using sufficient data that is available to show that access to financial services does make a whole lot of difference to women. Women who access financial products are more likely to enhance their productivity by as much as 40 to 50%, where I am speaking from in Africa. Now, if you've got that kind of piece of data and you know that women are important for solving the problems of your SDGs, that is the Sustainable Development Goals, whether it's access to health or education of children, because 70% of their income from women will go toward those things that matter for children, then you begin to design economic policy and the kinds of regulations and the institutions institutions and the enabling environment in a way that supports fintech being launched in your society in order to enable the women. I keep saying it, that the biggest asset of the women in Africa today is actually not a home. It is access to a smartphone. When a woman has access to a smartphone, she can make a lot of decisions. It's actually empowering to have that. And that's one step toward access to financial services. But that will not happen until somebody is paying attention to digital literacy, to the internet that they need to access, to matters of achieving scale, because some of these women are so much at the margins of operation that they don't make any sense, even to the fintech. And so how you create clustering amongst them to achieve that. There is a subsidy component to the development of financial services for the poor. And that's where, effective and sound policies would make a big difference. And that's something that is definitely a solution toward bridging the gap between men and women.
We should be investing in women, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it's a good thing for our economies. When we look at the amount of investment that goes into male startups versus female startups, with just 40% of the investment of a male startup, women are generating 10% better return. So there's a business case associated with this. This is a good thing for women. It's a good thing for society, but it's also a good thing for our economies. And I think it's just worth reiterating that point.
Absolutely. And then, Christian, I'm going to let you bring us home, but I just want to reinforce digital literacy, financial literacy leads to financial confidence and access. And we talk about smartphones and the next generation. So, Christian, bring us back to where do you think we will be 10 years from now? Where do you see the greatest opportunities for fintech in driving an economic growth, an economic opportunity, especially in the most marginalized parts of the world?
I think financial technology is just as any other technology. It leverages something that's already there, right? There's already lending. We just make lending more accessible. There's already cards, but we make them virtual so they're easier to use and so on, right? And I'll give you an example. And actually, Sue, we run the back end of your project because we run supply chain for Unilever. So all of those suppliers that's delivering to those stores on our software, and I'll give you a real world example. Before we built that kind of software, all of the software was built for desktop computers, like a big screen. Around 45% of businesses in Southeast Asia have desktop computers. The rest have smartphones. So if you don't build it for a smartphone, you can't even have them participate in that global supply chain. So they're already locked out to begin with. So I think the big solution, and where I'm optimist, is we have a lot more awareness. And I think a lot of that awareness is going to go into the design phase. And I think if we put it into the design phase, we are going to create solutions for generations to come. I also think there's a lot more awareness in the countries of pulling and having access to these technologies and understanding what they mean and how they drive an impact. My concerns are, though, that some of the next generation, as I said, for instance, 5G networks has some challenges in the way it's built for the West, essentially. It's built for big metropolises and big cities. I also think there's a challenge in how we're balkanizing the internet, right? Because the alternative to 5G might be Chinese satellite internet, it might be Elon Musk's SpaceX and other things, and they come with very different ideological packages. So I think, one thing I think about as I think about access in the future is who's going to own that access and why they're going to give it to you. And I think that's really something when we start thinking about the financial services and the intent of those financial services behind them. So I think it's important, and I hope we will have fair access to finance and fair access to internet and smartphones in the future.
Well, I think that you just brought that home. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. What is clear is technology is not just an enabler, it is a connector, and it is something that is a business essential for economic growth. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today.